The courthouse steps of Redemption Creek had never seen anything quite like Wallace Hadley on that blazing Tuesday morning in June of 1883. He stood there with his hat pushed back on his head, jaw set like granite, eyes burning with something that went far beyond anger. The crowd that had gathered, merchants, ranchers, wives clutching their bonnets against the dry Kansas wind, fell silent as he raised his voice to the blue and cloudless sky. "She has my name now." 4 words. 4 words that cracked through the summer heat like a rifle shot, and every person standing in that dusty square understood exactly what they meant. They meant that the papers being drawn up inside that courthouse, the papers that Silas Boone and his lawyer from Wichita had been working on since before sunrise, were worthless. They meant that whatever trap had been set for Frances Blackwell, Frances Hadley now, had just been sprung from the wrong direction entirely. Inside the courthouse, behind the thick wooden door with its peeling paint, a woman sat very still on a hard bench and listened to that voice cut through the walls. Her hands were folded in her lap with a forced calm that cost her everything she had. Her dark hair was pinned tightly at the back of her neck, and there were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of too many nights without sleep, too many days carrying a secret that had grown heavier with every passing mile between her and the life she had fled. Frances Blackwell, no, Frances Hadley closed her eyes, and for one trembling moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. She had not expected to be saved. She had certainly not expected to be saved like this. But to understand why those 4 words on the courthouse steps of Redemption Creek, Kansas, mattered so profoundly, you would have to go back 6 weeks. You would have to go back to a stagecoach full of dust and desperation, to a woman running from a dark past that refused to let go, and to a rancher who had never in his 31 years of life intended to fall in love with anyone. The stage from Dodge City arrived in Redemption Creek on a Thursday afternoon in late April, rattling and swaying over the last stretch of hardpan like it had somewhere better to be. Inside it, pressed against the wall opposite a snoring drummer and a minister reading his Bible with deep concentration, sat Frances Blackwell. She was 26 years old. She had $70 hidden in the lining of her traveling bag, a letter of introduction to a woman named Mrs. Hattie Combs who ran the boarding house on Sycamore Street, and absolutely nothing else in the world that was truly hers. She had red dust in her hair and a bruise, fading now to yellow at the edges, along her jaw that she had covered as best she could with the collar of her traveling coat. The drummer never noticed it. The minister had glanced at it once and looked quickly away, which told her everything she needed to know about how much help she could expect from that quarter. Redemption Creek was not a large town. Frances had known that coming in. It had a main street of perhaps 12 buildings on either side, a blacksmith, a general store, a saloon called the Gilded Spur, a small church with a crooked steeple, the courthouse that doubled as the sheriff's office, and Mrs. Combs's boarding house, which was the cleanest-looking building on the whole street and had a pot of red geraniums on the porch that made Frances's chest ache with something she could not quite name. Hope, maybe. The dangerous, fragile kind. She climbed down from the stage with her bag and her cardboard trunk and stood for a moment on the plank sidewalk while the world resettled around her. The air here smelled of horses and sun-baked earth and faintly of the river that she could see glinting to the west. The Cimarron cut through this part of Kansas in long, lazy bends, and in the late afternoon light it looked almost beautiful enough to make a person forget why they had come. Frances did not forget. She never forgot. The forgetting was a luxury she could not afford. She found Mrs. Combs exactly where the letter had promised she would be, on the porch with a bowl of green beans in her lap, snapping them with the calm efficiency of a woman who had been feeding other people for so long that it had become as natural as breathing. Hattie Combs was perhaps 55, with a round, shrewd face and gray hair and eyes the color of creek water that took Frances in from boots to hat brim in one long, assessing sweep. "Frances Blackwell," Hattie said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." You look like you've been dragged behind the stage rather than riding inside it." "It was a long road," Frances said. Hattie Combs set her beans aside and stood up. "Come in, then. I've got a room with a good window and a lock on the door." "I assume that matters to you." Frances looked at her steadily. "It does." "Then come in." The room was small but clean, with a white curtain that moved in the evening breeze and a narrow bed with a blue quilt that someone had made with real care, all small hexagons of calico and wool sewn together like a patchwork sky. Frances sat on the edge of it and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to take a full breath. She had escaped St. Louis. She had put 600 miles between herself and Silas Boone. She had run hard and smart and quietly, the way you had to run when the man you were running from had money and lawyers, and the kind of connections that meant the local sheriff would look the other way. Silas Boone was not her husband. He had wanted to be. That was the root of every problem Frances now carried like stones in her pockets. He had wanted to be, and she had said no, and he had responded to that no the way powerful men with dark appetites often responded to that word from women who had no one to stand behind them with force, and then with legal machinery, and then with the slow, grinding pressure of a man who intended to get what he wanted no matter how long it took. He had claimed a debt. He had manufactured one, really, out of the money he had given her father before her father died, money that Frances had known nothing about until the papers appeared, signed in her father's shaking hand 3 months before his death, and suddenly the debt was hers to pay, and Silas Boone had a very specific idea of how she ought to pay it. So she had run. And now she was here in Redemption Creek, with $70 and a bruise and a locked door and a blue quilt that someone had made with love, and she needed a plan. The plan started the next morning with a job. Hattie Combs ran the boarding house with steady, no-nonsense efficiency, and she needed help with the cooking and the laundry and the general keeping of 6 rooms occupied by traveling men. Frances could cook. She had been cooking since she was 9 years old. She could do laundry in her sleep. She offered to work for her room and board with a small wage besides, and Hattie looked at that fading bruise on her jaw and said yes without asking a single question about it. It was at Hattie's supper table, 3 evenings after she arrived, that Frances first heard the name Wallace Hadley. She was carrying a pot of beans to the table where 4 of Hattie's boarders were settling in for the evening meal, a dry goods traveler named Patterson, a young surveyor called Ned Finch, and 2 cowboys who were in town looking for work, when Patterson mid-sentence said the name. "Hadley won't sell," he was saying. "I've heard 3 men try it and every one of them walked away the same way they walked up, empty-handed and with a headache." "What does Hadley run?" the surveyor asked. "Cattle, mostly. Some horses. The Hadley land runs all the way from the South Fork of the Cimarron to the old Comanche trading road, best grassland in the county, and he knows it. His father built that ranch and his grandfather before that worked the land, and Wallace Hadley will die before he lets any piece of it go." "Fierce man?" one of the cowboys asked. Patterson smiled into his coffee. "Not fierce the way you mean. He doesn't come at you with a gun. He comes at you with those eyes of his, and he says his piece, and somehow you find yourself agreeing with him and not entirely sure how it happened." Frances set the pot down and went back to the kitchen and did not think about it again. She had no reason to. She thought about it 3 days later when she was hanging laundry on the line behind the boarding house in the early morning, and a man on a dark bay horse turned off the main road and came through the gate into the yard like he owned the surrounding county, which, she would later learn, he more or less did. He was tall in the saddle, which was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was that he did not slow down when he saw her standing there with a wet sheet in her hands, which meant he had expected to find someone and had not been startled by her presence. The third thing she noticed, when he swung down from the horse and turned toward her, was his face. It was the face of a man who had spent his life outdoors and had the sun and the wind written all over it, weathered, strong, with lines around his eyes from squinting against the horizon. He was perhaps 30 or 31, with dark hair and a jaw that was set in an expression of general purposefulness, and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray that caught the morning light and held it. "Mrs. Combs about," he said. "Inside," Frances said. "I'll get her." "Obliged." He waited by the gate with his hat in his hands, and Frances went in and told Hattie. And Hattie's face did something soft and fond that Frances had not seen it do before. "That's Wallace Hadley," Hattie said, untying her apron. "He comes by once a week to check on me. His mother and I were friends, God rest her." "He checks on you," Frances said. "Has done since his mother passed, 4 years now. Boy doesn't know how to let go of a responsibility once he's taken it up." Hattie said this with the affectionate exasperation of someone describing a virtue that occasionally made life complicated. Frances went back to the laundry and did not look at Wallace Hadley again. Or more accurately, she tried not to, and was only partially successful. He spent 20 minutes with Hattie on the porch, drinking coffee, and Frances could hear the low, steady sound of his voice without making out the words, and there was something in the rhythm of it unhurried, certain, that she found herself listening to despite herself. When he left, he nodded to her over the fence, and she nodded back, and that was the whole of it. For 3 days. On the 4th day after that, Frances made the mistake of going to the general store at the same time that Wallace Hadley was there collecting supplies for the ranch. She was pricing flour and salt pork and keeping her eyes on the task at hand when she heard him behind her at the counter, giving his list to old Mr. Prescott with that same unhurried voice, and then there was a pause and he was standing beside her. "You're Hattie's new girl," he said. Frances turned and looked at him directly. "I work for Mrs. Combs, yes. Seen you around." He was looking at her with a frank, measuring attention that was not rude but was entirely undisguised, the way a man who has spent his life assessing livestock and land and weather conditions looks at things honestly and without pretense. "You from Dodge?" "No. Before Dodge. East," she said. "Long way to come," he said, and there was nothing in his tone except simple observation, no prying, no push, but somehow the words settled over the conversation with a weight that acknowledged everything she hadn't said and left it respectfully alone. "Yes," she said. "Name's Wallace Hadley," he said, and held out his hand. She looked at it for one moment, that automatic hesitation that had become habit, and then shook it. "Frances Blackwell." His hand was large and rough and dry, and his grip was firm without being excessive, and he let go promptly. "Blackwell," he said, as if the name meant something, though she could not imagine how it would. "You know the name," she said, and something careful moved through her voice that she tried to keep out. "No," he said simply, "just saying it back so I remember it." He picked up his list from the counter. "Good day, Miss Blackwell." "Good day," she said. She watched him go without meaning to, and then looked back at her flower with the distinct and uncomfortable sensation that something had just shifted in the careful, defended order of her life, and she was not sure yet whether that shift was a disaster or something else entirely. Over the next 2 weeks, Frances settled into the rhythms of Redemption Creek with the quiet determination of someone who has been uprooted so many times that they have learned to put down roots quickly, like a plant adapted to harsh soil. She worked hard. She cooked well. She charmed the regular boarders without intending to, simply by being competent and kind, and genuinely interested in what people had to say. And Hattie Combs watched all of this with her sharp Creekwater eyes, and said nothing except to occasionally increase the small wage she paid without being asked. Frances made 2 friends. The first was a Mexican woman named Elena Vasquez, who did alterations and dressmaking out of a back room of her husband's saddle shop on the north end of Main Street. Elena was 32, and had been in Redemption Creek for 12 years and knew everything about everyone in it. And she told Frances what she knew freely and without venom, which was a kind of generosity that Frances had not encountered much in her life and valued enormously. The second friend she made was, unexpectedly, Wallace Hadley. It happened by degrees. He came to the boarding house every Thursday for his weekly visit to Hattie, and somehow the Thursday visits began to extend a little, and somehow Frances began to find reasons to be within speaking distance when he was there, not contriving it, not pushing toward it, simply finding that the gravitational force of the man was difficult to work against. He had that quality that the drummer on the stage from Dodge City had talked about, or rather, had not talked about, because the drummer had never encountered a man like Wallace Hadley. Patterson, the dry goods traveler, had talked about it. The way he said his piece, and somehow you found yourself agreeing and not sure how it happened. It was not manipulation. Frances was a woman who had been manipulated by an expert, and she knew the taste of it, and this was not that. It was something more straightforward. Wallace Hadley had opinions, and he stated them plainly, and he listened when you stated yours. And if your reasoning was sound, he shifted, and if it wasn't, he held, and the whole exchange happened with a directness that Frances, raised in a world of social maneuvering and hidden motives, found strangely, almost embarrassingly, restful. He told her about the ranch. Not in a boasting way, but in the way a man talks about the thing that is most essentially himself. The south pasture with the good grass, the creek that ran clean year-round, the herd of 750 head he'd built from the 200 his father had left him. He had 12 hands working for him and a cook named Amos who had been on the Hadley land since before Wallace was born and considered himself the unelected mayor of the bunkhouse. He had a barn that needed a new roof and a fence line on the eastern edge of the property that he was in a running dispute with a neighbor about, and he spoke about the fence dispute with the precise, patient exasperation of a man who has been absolutely right about something for 2 years and is waiting for the world to catch up. Frances told him less. Not nothing. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, about her father who had been a good man made smaller by bad luck and bad health, about her mother who had died when Frances was 15 and left a hole in the family that had never quite healed over. She told him she had worked as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant before coming west, which was true, and she did not tell him why she had stopped. She watched him absorb what she offered without grabbing for more, and she liked him for it enormously, and she tried not to like him too much, because she knew that what was following her down from St. Louis had not given up, and she could not afford to bring that kind of trouble to a man who had done nothing to deserve it. She almost managed it. She almost managed to keep a proper, polite, friendly but not too close distance from Wallace Hadley, right up until the evening in late May when she was walking back from Alina's shop in the early dark, and the two men stepped out of the alley beside the Gilded Spur, and one of them grabbed her arm. They were not cowboys. She could see that at once. They were dressed like cowboys, but they moved wrong, with the particular lazy confidence of men who did their work in doorways and back rooms rather than on horseback. The one holding her arm had a city smell under the trail dust, and when he smiled at her there was nothing behind the smile at all. "Miss Blackwell," he said, like a greeting. "Mr. Boone sends his regards." Everything in Frances went cold and terribly still. "He wants to know when you're planning to come back to St. Louis," the man said. "He's a patient fellow, but even patient fellows have limits." "Tell him I'm not coming back," Frances said, and was proud of how level her voice came out. "See, that's the thing he said you'd say." The man tightened his grip. "He also said if you said that to tell you about the second set of papers his lawyer filed, the ones about fraud." "There is no fraud." "Maybe not, but proving that takes a lawyer and a judge and time, and Mr. Boone's got all three on his side, and you've got—" He looked around at the empty street with theatrical patience. "What exactly have you got, Miss Blackwell?" The answer to that question came from behind him, and it came in the form of Wallace Hadley's voice, which had dropped to a register she had not heard from him before, still quiet, still steady, but carrying something in it now that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Take your hand off her arm," he said. He was standing at the mouth of the alley, not 6 feet away, and he had appeared with such complete silence that neither man had heard him coming. He was not holding a gun. He was simply standing there with that quality of absolute stillness that she was coming to understand was not calm, but rather the concentrated force of a man who has never in his life felt the need to make himself larger than he was because he already knew exactly how large he was. The man holding Frances's arm turned slowly, assessed the situation, and made, Frances thought, an intelligent decision. He let go of her arm. "We're just talking," he said. "You're done talking," Wallace said. "You'll be on the first stage out of Redemption Creek tomorrow morning. If I see either of you still in town by noon tomorrow, you'll have a conversation with Sheriff Danvers that you will find considerably less comfortable than this one. Am I clear?" The two men exchanged a look, and then the one who had held her arm smiled again, that empty smile, and said, "We'll pass along your message to Mr. Boone," and they walked off down the street without hurrying, which was its own kind of threat. Frances stood very still and waited for her hands to stop shaking. Wallace came to stand beside her and for a moment said nothing, just stood there in the dark street while the sounds of the gilded spur filtered out into the evening, and somewhere down by the river a coyote called. "You want to tell me about it?" he said finally. "No," she said, a pause. "All right. It's not." She stopped, started again. "It will follow me here. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry if it involves—" "It doesn't involve you apologizing to me," he said. "Those were hired men. Whoever sent them has money, and they mentioned papers and a lawyer." He looked at her sideways in the dark. "You're running from a legal threat, not just a physical one." Frances said nothing. "That's a different kind of problem than a simple bully," he said. "That's a problem that needs a different kind of solution." "I know what kind of problem it is," she said, and perhaps more sharpness came into her voice than she intended because she was frightened, and frightened people sometimes sharpen their edges at the wrong targets. "I've been living with it for months." "I know you have," he said, without any change in tone. "I'm not criticizing you, Frances. I'm trying to understand what you're up against." The use of her given name, the first time he had used it, she realized, though they had been in each other's company a dozen times by now, moved through her with a warmth she was not prepared for. She told him then. Not all of it, and not immediately. It came out in pieces over the next hour as they sat on the steps of the boarding house in the warm May dark, and Hattie brought them coffee without asking, and then went back inside with the tact of a woman who understood exactly when people needed to be left alone together. Frances told him about her father's debt, about Silas Boone's offer and her refusal, about the papers and the bruise and the 600 miles. Wallace listened to all of it with that absolute, unclouded attention that she had come to recognize as one of his most essential qualities. He did not interrupt. He did not tell her what she should have done or offer hollow reassurances. When she was finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark street. "This Boone," he said, "he's got a lawyer in Wichita. A man named Thackeray, very well connected." "Judge Crawford in Wichita is honest," Wallace said, as if pulling up information from a filing cabinet in his head. "Whatever papers Boone's filed, if they're fraudulent, Crawford will see it. The problem is getting a counterargument in front of him with enough documentation to make it stick." He paused. "Do you have any of your father's original papers, the ones before the debt claim?" "Some," she said. "I have letters. I have the record of payments my father made to a different creditor around the same time period, which I believe contradicts the Boone debt timeline." Wallace turned to look at her directly in the dark, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen before, not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if a piece of information had just fallen into place. "You thought this through," he said. "I've had a lot of time to think." "Who's your lawyer?" "I don't have one. I can't afford one." He was quiet again. Then, "I know a man in Wichita, name of Robert Carr. He worked with my father on the land title case we had with the railroad 4 years back. He's good and he's honest, and he owes me a courtesy." Frances looked at him. In the lamplight from the boarding house window, she could see the set of his jaw, the line of his mouth, the way his hands rested loose on his knees with that particular stillness. "You don't owe me anything," she said carefully. "No," he agreed, "I don't." "Then why?" "Because 2 men put their hands on you in my town," he said, and because whatever Silas Boone is doing to you is wrong, and because I can help." He said these three things in a flat, simple sequence that allowed for no argument, and then he added, with something that might have been the beginning of a smile in the corner of his voice, "and because Hattie Combs would never forgive me if I didn't." Frances looked down at her hands in her lap. They had stopped shaking. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He wrote to Robert Carr in Wichita the next day. Over the following week, something changed between them that neither of them named directly, because naming things directly would have required acknowledging what those things were, and they were both, in their different ways, people who had learned to be careful about that kind of acknowledgement. But Frances noticed. She noticed the way he found reasons to be in town on days that were not Thursdays. She noticed the way conversations that had been brief became longer, and the way longer conversations became the kind that meandered out past the edges of the original topic and into territory that had nothing to do with lawyers or debt claims or hired men. Territory that had to do with what they each believed about things, the kind of country they each loved, the books they had read in the gaps between work. Whether the railroad coming through was going to be a salvation or a disaster for the small ranchers of western Kansas. She noticed, and she felt it herself, the slow, irreversible process of two people finding the shape of each other, the edges where they fitted and the edges where they didn't, and discovering that the places where they didn't fit were interesting rather than impossible. She was careful. She told herself to be careful. She had Silas Boone's hired men somewhere in her rear view, and a legal threat she still hadn't put to rest, and a past that had a way of arriving without warning, and she was not in a position to add a complicated heart to the list of things she was managing. But then there was an afternoon in early June when a summer storm came up fast over the western horizon, the way Kansas storms did 1 minute clear sky, and the next a wall of gray-green cloud bearing down with the full authority of the plains behind it. And Frances was caught in the kitchen garden behind the boarding house, and Wallace had been there helping her repair the garden gate that had come loose, and the storm arrived before either of them could do more than look up at it. And they ran laughing to the covered porch and stood there together in the drumming noise of the rain, and Frances was laughing, really laughing, for the first time in she could not remember how long, and she looked up and found Wallace looking at her with an expression that was so open and so honest and so completely unguarded that it stopped the laugh in her throat. He looked away first, looked back out at the rain. "You have a good laugh," he said. Frances looked at the rain. "Do I?" "Yes," he said simply. And that was all. But after that she stopped pretending to herself that she wasn't falling in love with him. The letter from Robert Carr arrived on a Wednesday 9 days after Wallace had written. Frances was in the dining room setting the table for supper when Hattie brought it in, and she read it twice standing there with a fork in her hand, and then she sat down slowly in one of the dining chairs and read it a third time. Carr's news was mixed. The good. He had examined the Boone debt claim and found 3 significant inconsistencies in the documentation. The bad. Boone's lawyer Thackeray had already filed an injunction in the Wichita court that would, if it went through, freeze any transfer of Frances's assets and effectively bind her to appear before a judge to answer the fraud claim. A fraud claim which, even if ultimately dismissed, would take months and cost more money than she had. There was a third piece of information in Carr's letter that Frances read and reread until the words blurred slightly at the edges. He wrote that the most expedient solution to the legal trap would be a change in Frances's legal status. A woman with a husband of legal standing in the state of Kansas could contest the Boone claim from a position of considerably more strength. The debt, as Boone had structured it, had been designed for a single woman without resources or connections. It was not designed to hold against a married woman with a husband who had both. Frances sat with that for a long time. Then she folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to setting the table for supper. She did not tell Wallace what the letter said that evening. She needed to think. She thought about it all that night, lying under the blue quilt with the white curtain moving in the warm air and the faint sounds of the town settling into sleep drifting through the window. She thought about it hard and honestly, the way she thought about everything, turning it over and looking at all the sides. The solution Carr suggested was the most practical one, but practical was not the same as right, and she was not the kind of woman who mistook the two. Using a man's name as a legal shield was one thing when the man understood what he was getting into. Asking Wallace Hadley to involve himself in her legal nightmare, asking him to put his own reputation, and standing in the sights of Silas Boone's lawyer was something else entirely. She would not ask him. She resolved this firmly in the dark of her room, and then lay there with the resolution sitting on her chest like a stone, and eventually fell into an uneasy sleep. She had not counted on Wallace Hadley going to see Robert Carr himself. He had taken the stage to Wichita without telling her, spending 2 days away from the ranch on business that Amos the cook managed with the offended efficiency of a man who considered himself indispensable, and was not wrong. He came back on a Friday evening while Frances was in the kitchen making pie crust, and he came in through the back door because he had clearly ridden from the stage depot directly without stopping at his ranch first, and he had dust on his boots and the particular expression of a man who has come to say something specific. Hattie took one look at his face and discovered a reason to be in the parlor. Wallace sat down at the kitchen table and put his hat on it and looked at Frances, who had stopped rolling pie crust and was watching him with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. "I went to see Carr," he said. "I know. He told you. He wrote again on Thursday. He mentioned you'd been in." She looked at him steadily. "I wish you'd told me. I know I should have." He met her gaze. "I needed to understand the full situation before I said anything to you, and now you understand it." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the evening was doing what Kansas evenings did in early June, turning the whole western sky into something extravagant, orange and pink and a deep bruised purple at the edges, the kind of sky that made you feel like the world was much larger than any problem it currently contained. "Carr told me about the injunction." "Yes. And he told me about the other thing." A pause. "The legal status thing." Frances turned back to her pie crust. "That's not something I was going to ask of you," she said very precisely. "I want you to know that, whatever Carr may have said, he didn't suggest it to me," Wallace said. "He explained it as context. The suggestion is mine." Frances's rolling pin stopped moving. "I've thought about it carefully," Wallace said. "I'm not a man who does things without thinking them through. You know that by now." "This is not something to be thought through like a fence-line dispute," Frances said, and there was something in her voice now that she couldn't entirely control, something that wanted to crack. "This is a marriage." "Yes," he said. "I'm aware of that." She turned to look at him. He was sitting at the table with both hands flat on the worn wood, watching her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. Not the carefully managed openness of a man trying to be kind, but something rawer and more real, something that had the particular quality of a man saying a thing he has not said aloud before but has known for a long time. "I am not asking you out of charity," he said. "I want to be very clear about that. I am not asking you because I feel responsible for you or because I am in the habit of fixing things that need fixing. I am asking you because in the past 6 weeks I have become," he paused, choosing the word with the care he gave to everything. "I have become extremely unwilling to think about a version of the future that does not include you in it." Frances looked at him for a long, long moment. "Wallace," she said. "I know it's fast," he said. "I know your situation is complicated, and I know you came here running, and I know you have not had much reason lately to trust men who offer you things. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to make a practical decision with the information you have, and the information you have is that I am a man with 3,000 acres and a clean legal standing in this state, and a strong and genuine desire to have you around for a very long time." A pause. "And that I think you are the most remarkable person I have met in my entire life." Frances put the rolling pin down very carefully on the floured board. Her hands were not shaking. She was not going to let her hands shake. "That is the most unromantic proposal I have ever heard," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Was it a proposal? He said, and there was a carefully contained something in his voice, not quite hope, but the edge of it. "Wasn't it?" A beat. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it was." Frances looked at the pie crust. She looked at the window and the extravagant Kansas evening beyond it. She thought about Silas Boone and his lawyers and his hired men and the trap that had been closing around her by degrees for months. She thought about her father, who had been a good man undone by circumstance, and her mother, who had not lived long enough to teach her daughter what love ought to look like. She thought about the blue quilt and the locked door and the particular quality of warmth she felt when Wallace Hadley was in a room. "If I say yes," she said, "it will be because I want to, not because of Boone or the legal situation. I need you to understand that." "I understand that," he said, "and if I say yes, it will be because I am saying yes to you, not to a legal arrangement." "I understand that too." She looked at him directly. "Yes," she said. "Then." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something that neither of them had adequate words for yet, something that was going to need time and ordinary life, and all the regular days of building a shared existence before it could be fully named. But the shape of it was there, present in the kitchen with them, warm as the evening light coming through the window. Wallace stood up and came around the table and stood close to her, and she looked up at him in the way you look at something you have been trying not to look at too directly, and he took her flour-dusted hand in his large rough one, and held it for a moment, and then he lifted it and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a formality that was so unexpected and so sincere that it went straight to her chest like a key finding a lock. "I will do everything in my power to make this good for you," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know it," she said. They were married at the courthouse in Redemption Creek on the 8th of June, 1883, by Justice of the Peace Henry Albright, with Hattie Combs and Elena Vasquez as witnesses and Sheriff Danvers standing in the doorway because Hattie had told him to, and he had learned not to argue with Hattie Combs. The ceremony was brief and plain, just the two of them and the official words, and the gold ring that Wallace had ridden to Dodge City to buy 2 days before, which fit Frances's finger as if it had been made for her specifically, which it had not been, but which felt as if it might have been, the way the right things sometimes did. Afterward, Hattie made a celebration supper with a cake and the good tablecloth she kept for special occasions, and Elena brought wine that her husband had been saving for a worthy cause, and there was, for one evening, a brightness in the boarding-house dining room that did not have anything to do with tragedy or running or legal threats. Just 4 people around a table celebrating a beginning. Later, when the others had gone and the house was quiet, Frances sat on the edge of the bed in her room with the blue quilt and looked at the ring on her finger and felt something complicated and real moving through her. It was not entirely happiness, because she was too honest with herself for that. It was not fear either, or not entirely. It was the particular weight of a significant moment, the feeling of a hinge swinging, of everything that came before on one side and everything that came after on the other, and you in the middle of it, irreversibly committed, and the choice being one you would make again without hesitation, which was the only honest test of any choice. She was Frances Hadley now. Not in her heart yet, that would take time, but on paper, in law, in the record of the state of Kansas, she was Frances Hadley. And that, as Robert Carr had explained, made an enormous practical difference to the situation. They sent the marriage certificate to Carr in Wichita the next morning by telegraph. Carr, in turn, filed the counter-documentation against the Boone debt claim with Judge Crawford, along with the 3 inconsistencies he had found in the original papers and the timeline contradictions that Frances had identified in her father's records. The telegraph wires carried messages back and forth over the following week, and with each exchange, the Boone trap weakened slightly. Crawford was looking at the documentation. Crawford had requested additional records from the St. Louis court. The Thackeray injunction was being reviewed, but Silas Boone was not a man who lost gracefully. On the 12th of June, 4 days after the wedding, Frances was sorting linens in the upstairs hallway of the boarding house when Hattie called up the stairs with a particular quality of tension in her voice that made Frances put the linens down and come to the top of the stairs and look down. A man was standing in the front hallway. Not a hired man this time. The man himself. Silas Boone was perhaps 45, with the kind of florid, well-fed handsomeness that money and comfort could buy, and that money and comfort were slowly, year by year, overtaking. He was dressed expensively for a man who had presumably ridden a long way, and he held his hat in his hands with the practiced charm of someone who had learned that a hat held in the hands rather than on the head made a man look respectful and therefore non-threatening, and he was looking up at Frances on the stairs with an expression that was composed entirely of the surfaces of politeness, and underneath those surfaces was completely cold. "Frances," he said, "you look well." Frances came down the stairs at a measured pace and stopped 4 steps from the bottom, which put her at eye level with him and kept a staircase between them, which was not accidental. "Mr. Boone," she said. "I heard you've gotten yourself married," he said, and his tone implied that this was the kind of low tactic he would have expected from her. "To a local cattleman." "That's right. Quick work," he said and smiled. "What do you want, Mr. Boone?" His smile did not change, but his eyes did, just slightly, just enough. "I want what I've always wanted, Frances. A resolution to our outstanding business. Your father's debt to me is a matter of record, regardless of whatever papers your husband's lawyer has been waving around in Wichita." "The debt is fraudulent," Frances said. "Judge Crawford is currently reviewing that. I suggest you speak to Mr. Thackeray about what that review is likely to conclude." A pause. "You've gotten bold," Boone said. "I've always been bold," Frances said. "I was just alone before." Something moved through Boone's expression at that, not anger exactly, but the specific, cold reaction of a man who does not like the thing that has changed in the calculation. He looked at Hattie, who was standing by the parlor door with her arms folded and her Creekwater eyes at their most arctic, and then he looked back at Frances. "Where is your husband?" he said. "At his ranch," Frances said, 3 miles south. "I'll be happy to send word that you'd like to speak with him." Another pause. Then Boone put his hat back on his head and said, "I'll be staying at the hotel. I'd encourage your husband to come see me before I go back to Wichita, Frances. There are conversations that would be better had quietly, between reasonable people, before they become matters of public record." "I'll tell him you said so," Frances said. Boone left. The front door closed behind him, and Frances stood on the staircase for a moment with her hands gripping the rail, and then she sat down right there on the step and pressed her forehead to her knees. "He's not getting what he came for," Hattie said from the parlor doorway. "He never stops," Frances said. "That's the thing about him. He never stops." "Some men don't until they're stopped," Hattie said. "You want me to send for Wallace?" Frances lifted her head. "Yes," she said, "please." Wallace arrived before noon, riding hard, and the expression on his face when he came through the door and crossed to where Frances was sitting in the parlor was something she would remember for a long time. Not anger, not fear, but a kind of absolute, concentrated certainty. The face of a man who has identified what needs to be done and is arranging himself to do it. He sat across from her and she told him everything, and he listened with the same full attention he always gave. And when she was done, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I want to speak to him. Wallace, not with threats. I want to speak to him plainly in a public place about what the actual legal situation is and what he stands to lose by continuing to pursue this." He paused, "And I want him to understand very clearly who it is he's dealing with now." Frances looked at him. "He's dangerous in a particular way," she said. "He operates through legal pressure. He buys what he needs." "Then we take away what he's buying," Wallace said. "Carr has Crawford's ear. We need Crawford to rule before Boone can file anything further. Can Carr move the review timeline up? I don't know. I'm going to wire Carr right now and ask. He stood. Stay here, don't go anywhere alone. I know how to look after myself, Frances said with some spirit. I know you do, he said without any condescension. I'm saying it because I would like you to stay safe, not because I think you're incapable. He paused and then added more quietly, please. The please was the thing that got her. There was nothing imperious or manipulative in it. It was just a man asking honestly because he was worried, and the honesty of it was somehow harder to resist than any demand could have been. All right, she said. He wired Carr. Carr's response came back within 2 hours. Crawford had been reviewing the documentation and was close to a ruling. The fraudulent nature of the debt claim, given the timeline inconsistencies Frances had identified, was becoming increasingly clear. Carr expected a ruling within the week, possibly sooner. Wallace met with Silas Boone that afternoon in the dining room of the Redemption Creek Hotel, which was public enough to keep the tone civil and small enough that their conversation was very nearly the whole point of the room. Frances was not there. She had agreed to stay at the boarding house, but she heard afterward from Alina, whose cousin happened to be clearing tables at the hotel that afternoon, what had been said. Wallace had been quiet and direct. He had laid out, without drama or threat, the precise state of the legal documentation in Wichita and what Crawford's review was likely to conclude. He had made clear that the debt claim, once declared fraudulent by the court, would constitute a legal liability for Boone himself, which his own lawyer had presumably explained to him. He had offered, in the spirit of practical resolution, a formal agreement, Boone to withdraw the claim and the injunction, in exchange for which Wallace would not pursue the fraud finding to its fullest legal conclusion. Boone had listened to all of this with an expression that was not readable by Alina's cousin, who had been discreetly moving dishes around and trying not to be noticed. Then Boone had said, "You love her." Wallace had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, "That is not the basis of the legal offer I've just made you, but yes." Boone had laughed at that, or something that had the shape of a laugh. "You understand that she came to this marriage with a legal liability attached. She came to this marriage with a dark past that was manufactured for her by a man who couldn't accept the word no," Wallace said. "I understand the difference." Another silence. And then Boone had put on his hat and stood up and said, "I'll speak to Thackeray." He had left Redemption Creek on the afternoon stage the next day. 2 days after that, the Telegraph brought a message from Carr. Crawford had ruled. The debt claim was declared fraudulent. The injunction was dissolved. Thackeray had quietly filed withdrawal papers on behalf of Boone, which Crawford had accepted. It was over. Frances read the telegram 3 times standing in the doorway of the boarding house with Hattie behind her, and the June sun falling warm on the plank sidewalk. And the feeling that moved through her was so large that for a moment she could not sort out any of the parts of it. Relief, and something that felt like grief for the months of carrying this alone, and a sharp, bright gratitude that felt entirely insufficient to what had been given to her, and underneath all of it, the particular warmth that had become inseparably associated in her mind with a man who said things plainly and listened fully, and had told Silas Boone, in a hotel dining room, simply and without decoration, that yes, he loved her. She was on her way to the stable to get a horse to ride out to the ranch when she remembered that she had never said it back. She had not said it to him at all. She stopped in the middle of the street with that realization and stood there for a moment, slightly stunned by her own omission, and then she picked up her pace considerably. It was a 3-mile ride south to the Hadley ranch, and she had borrowed Hattie's old roan mare, who was reliable rather than fast, and the 3 miles stretched out in the summer heat with a patience that Frances did not currently share. On either side of the road, the Kansas grassland moved in long, slow waves in the wind, green and gold and infinite, and the sky above it was that particular shade of deep blue that only appeared on clear summer days when the humidity was low and the air was clean, and under other circumstances, Frances would have found it beautiful and probably cried a little from the sheer openness of it. But at the moment she was focused on getting to where she was going. The Hadley ranch sat in a wide, grassy bowl between two gentle rises, with the Cimarron glinting to the west, and a stand of cottonwood trees along the creek that ran through the property. The main house was larger than she had imagined from his descriptions, 2 stories of solid, well-maintained timber, with a wide porch and a kitchen garden on the south side, and the barn and outbuildings arranged in a practical, orderly arc to the north. It was a working ranch in every sense, not decorated or prettified, but built with care and maintained with pride, and everything about it had the quality of permanence, of things built to last. Wallace was not at the house. One of the hands, a young man named Clem who appeared to be approximately 17 and handled horses with exceptional grace, told her he was down by the south fence, working on the line. She rode south. She found him a half-mile out, on his knees in the grass with a fencing tool and a coil of wire, working on a section of fence with the total, absorbed attention he brought to everything. He heard the horse approaching and looked up, and when he saw it was her, he put the fencing tool down and stood, and something moved through his face, the beginning of a question. Frances pulled the roan up and swung down and came toward him with the telegram folded in her hand. "Crawford ruled," she said. "It's over. Boone is gone. The claim is dismissed." He read the telegram carefully and then folded it and handed it back, and his face did that thing it did when he was keeping something contained, a kind of stillness that she now understood was not absence of feeling but its opposite. "Good," he said. "Wallace," she stopped. The words she had come to say were right there, fully formed, and she was not a woman who was afraid of saying things that needed to be said. But there was something about standing in a Kansas pasture in the June heat with the grass moving around her and the cottonwoods in the middle distance that made the ordinary words feel insufficient for the size of the moment. She said them anyway. "I love you," she said. "I should have said it before now. I've known it for weeks, honestly, probably since the night of the storm on the porch. But I was afraid of needing it, I suppose. Of needing you. I have been very careful for a long time about not needing anyone." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he walked the 3 steps between them and took her face in his large, rough hands with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the size and strength of them, and he kissed her. Not with urgency or demand, but with the full and unhurried sincerity of a man saying something that words are inadequate for, and the kiss tasted like the Kansas wind and June heat, and something that Frances thought might be the beginning of the rest of her life. When they separated, she was smiling, and his eyes were warm, and he was looking at her with that open, unguarded expression that still knocked the breath out of her, even though she had seen it several times now. "I've loved you since you told me about the letters you kept to contradict the timeline," he said. Frances laughed. "That is a very specific moment to have chosen. You'd been running scared for months, and you still had the clarity of mind to gather counter-documentation," he said. "It was the most impressive thing I'd seen since my father held off a federal marshal with a land deed and a firm voice." She laughed again, and he pulled her into his arms and held her there in the summer pasture, while the grass moved around them, and the Cimarron glinted to the west, and somewhere in the cottonwoods, a meadowlark was carrying on a one-sided conversation with the afternoon. They went back to the house together, and Amos, the cook, who had been watching from the barn with the professional discretion of a man who had been on this land for 30 years and knew every one of its rhythms, turned back to his work with the satisfied expression of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. Frances met the hands that evening at supper in the bunkhouse, which Amos managed with the same autocratic efficiency with which he managed everything, and she won their guarded respect within the first 10 minutes by eating the beans without complaint and asking intelligent questions about the Cimarron Ford and whether it was likely to flood in August and understanding the answers. And after that there was no awkwardness about the situation, which was a relief to everyone. She moved to the ranch that week. She did not leave Hattie completely. She rode in every Thursday for supper at the boarding house, which became a tradition that outlasted everyone's expectations, and she brought eggs and preserves from the ranch kitchen, and Hattie received these with the dignified gratitude of a woman who knows when she has done a good thing. Living with Wallace was different from knowing him. She had understood that it would be. But the particular texture of the difference was something she had not been able to predict, because it was made of small things. The way he woke early and started coffee before she was up, and the coffee was always exactly as she liked it, not because he had asked, but because he had paid attention. The way he argued with her about the kitchen garden layout with complete seriousness, as if it were genuinely the most important conversation happening on the Great Plains that morning, and then accepted her counter-proposal about where to put the bean rows with the intellectual honesty of a man who could be persuaded by a better argument. The way he read in the evenings with the focused absorption of someone who lived inside books when he was in them, and occasionally read aloud to her without asking, just began reading aloud mid-paragraph when he hit something worth sharing. There were harder things too. The adjustment of two self-sufficient people learning to share space without erasing themselves. The moments when Frances's carefully defended edges bumped against Wallace's stubborn certainties, and they both had to work through the friction with the patience that real things require. The morning when the anniversary of her father's death came, and she could not explain to herself why she felt so hollow, and could not explain it to him either, and he had simply stayed close without requiring explanation, and that had been the right thing, and she had known in that moment that she was going to be all right. She had also known in that moment that she was completely in love with him, which was a different thing from the love she had recognized in the pasture, deeper and more rooted, the kind that knows it is in the presence of something it intends to keep. The summer of 1883 moved across the Kansas plains with the slow authority of a season that knows it will not be hurried. The cattle were doing well. The hay was put up in good time. The Cimarron stayed within its banks, which it did not always oblige to do, and the south pasture grass was the best Wallace could remember seeing. Frances took over the ranch accounts from Amos, who had been keeping them with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and brought them into a state of clarity that made Wallace look at the numbers for a long time and then look at her and say, "I was spending more on the Eastern hay supplier than I needed to. There are two others within 40 miles who are cheaper and just as reliable." "I noticed," Frances said. "You've been here 3 months," he said. "I've been keeping books since I was 20, she said. "Patterns tend to be visible if you know what you're looking for." He hired the cheaper hay supplier. And he looked at her sometimes, in the evenings when the work was done and the lamps were lit, and the ranch was settling into its nighttime quiet, with an expression that was not quite wonder but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who keeps being surprised by a thing he already thought he knew, and finding the surprises entirely welcome. In September, the fence dispute with the neighbor to the east, a man named Cutter who had been shifting his fence posts incrementally for 2 years in a way that was technically deniable but practically unmistakable, came to a head. Cutter had moved the line again, this time enough to encroach on a section of Hadley grazing land that Wallace had been tolerating the gradual approach of, with the kind of patience that has its absolute limits. Frances went with him to the conversation with Cutter, which surprised Cutter considerably, and she said nothing during it but stood beside Wallace with a quality of calm attention that was somehow more disconcerting than any active contribution would have been. And afterward Wallace told her that Cutter had looked at her twice with the expression of a man trying to figure out what the variable he had not accounted for in his calculations was. "The fence will go back," Wallace said. "It will," Frances agreed. "It did within a week. In October, a letter arrived from Robert Carr in Wichita. It was brief and professional and contained, at the end, a single sentence that had nothing professional in it. He wrote that he had heard from a court contact that Silas Boone was under investigation in St. Louis for similar fraudulent debt practices involving 3 other parties, and that the investigation was likely to result in significant legal consequence. He added that he thought Frances would want to know. Frances read this letter at the kitchen table and then folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box where she kept important papers and said nothing for a moment. Wallace watched her from across the table. "Relief," he said. "Yes," she said. "And something else." She looked for the word. "Vindication, I suppose. It's strange, I knew it was true all along, but there's something about the world finally catching up to what you knew, that it matters. Even when it's over, it still matters." "It matters," he agreed. She looked at him. "I'm done being afraid of him," she said. "I think I have been for a while, actually, but I wanted to say it out loud." "All right," he said. "Say it as many times as you need to." "I'm done being afraid of him," she said, a second time, and smiled and meant it entirely. The winter of 1883 came in across the Kansas plains with a patience, and then a sudden ferocity that was entirely characteristic of its nature. Weeks of mild, misleadingly pleasant weather followed by 3 days in December of a blizzard that came in from the northwest and covered everything in a silence that was at once beautiful and absolute. The ranch hands were in the bunkhouse, and the cattle were in the lower pastures where the draws offered some shelter, and Frances and Wallace were in the main house with the wood stove going full, and the windows opaque with frost, and the enforced intimacy of that time. The two of them entirely alone in the storm-buried silence of the house for 3 days was something that Frances afterward thought of as the final sealing of a thing that had already been building all year. They talked about everything. Not the large dramatic things, but the small ones, the accumulated texture of a life, what he had been like as a boy, reckless in the way of boys who love horses and open space, devoted to his mother in the complicated way of sons who understand only later what their mothers were carrying. What Frances had been like as a girl, reading everything she could get her hands on because books were reliably kind in a way that people sometimes weren't, determined from a young age with a determination that had felt at the time like stubbornness, but that she now understood had been essential self-preservation. On the second evening of the blizzard, sitting by the stove with the wind scrabbling at the walls like something that wanted in, Wallace said, quietly, without preamble, "I want children. I should have said that before we married because it's a thing you ought to have a voice in, and I should have given you that voice." Frances looked at the fire for a moment. "I want them too," she said. "I didn't say it either." "Then we're agreed." "We're agreed," she said, and felt the warmth of that simple word agreed and all the future it implied. The blizzard passed, and December settled into the quiet cold of deep winter, and January came in with clear skies and hard frost in February, with the first suggestions of softening. By the time the spring of 1884 was beginning to work its slow change across the Kansas grassland, Frances knew she was expecting a child, and she told Wallace on a March evening when the first green was just beginning to show at the roots of the dead winter grass, and the river was running high with snowmelt. He stood very still for a moment and said nothing, and then he took her hands and held them with a care that seemed almost excessive until she looked at his face and saw what was in it, a depth of feeling so large it had briefly taken language from him, and she thought that she had never loved anyone more than she loved him in that moment, which was a thing she thought she had thought before and would think again, and which kept being true each time she thought it. The pregnancy was good. Frances was strong and practical, and she worked the ranch accounts through April and May and into June, and rode horseback until Wallace became anxious about it, and she agreed, mostly to preserve domestic peace, to switch to the buggy. She read books and managed the kitchen garden, and argued with Amos about the proper consistency of gravy, and won decisively because she was right. And she wrote long letters to Hattie and Alina, and received long letters back. And she was happy in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of difficulty, and everything to do with the presence of the right company. Her son was born in November of 1884, in the main house of the Hadley ranch, with a capable midwife named Mrs. Pryor from town who had been delivering babies in Redemption Creek for 20 years and had the unflappable competence of someone who had seen everything and was not inclined to panic. They named him James Henry Hadley, James for Wallace's father, Henry for Frances's. He was red-faced and entirely vocal about his opinions from the first moment, which Wallace observed with great satisfaction as evidence of a strong character. That first night, with James asleep in the cradle that Wallace had made himself from cottonwood from the creek, sanding it to a smoothness that bore no relationship to any practical necessity, but that he had done with the care of love, Frances lay in the lamplight and looked at her husband sitting on the edge of the bed watching the cradle with an expression she had no words for, and she thought about the courthouse steps. She had not been there when he said it. She had been inside, sitting on that hard bench, and the words had come through the walls to her. But she had thought about those 4 words, "She has my name now," more than she had expected to, and what she had decided about them was this: they were not a declaration of ownership. They were a declaration of allegiance. An announcement, made on the courthouse steps of Redemption Creek in the hearing of every merchant and ranch wife and cowboy in the square, that whatever anyone was planning to do to Frances Blackwell, they would have to come through Wallace Hadley to do it, and that Wallace Hadley had placed himself between her and that thing deliberately and completely and without reservation. She had not always had anyone place themselves between her and the hard things. She had had her father who had loved her but been diminished by time and circumstance. She had had no one after him. And then in a boarding house kitchen in western Kansas, she had found this man who said things plainly and listened fully and would stand on courthouse steps and announce to the whole town that she was his to protect, not because she was incapable of protecting herself, but because he wanted to. The distinction mattered. It had always mattered. "Wallace," she said. He turned from the cradle. "The courthouse steps," she said. "I never properly said thank you for that." He looked at her with an expression of mild puzzlement. "You don't need to thank me for that." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to, a beat." "You're welcome," he said, and the simplicity of it was exactly right. James grew through the winter of 1884 and the spring of 1885 with the robust energy of a child who has access to clean air, good food, and 2 parents who adore him while not entirely losing their minds over him. He was interested in everything, the horses first, but also the calves and the dogs and the cook's enormous black cat, which tolerated James's attentions with the stoic resignation of a creature that has decided patience is the better part of valor. Amos, who had maintained for 30 years that the kitchen was a professional domain unsuited to civilian interference, made an exception for James Hadley from approximately his 6th month, and by the time James was a year old, there was a small wooden stool kept beside the kitchen counter for him specifically. And Amos was overheard on more than one occasion explaining the proper temperature for pie crust water to an audience that was currently more focused on a dried apple than on professional kitchen technique. Hattie came out to the ranch for Christmas of 1885, and Alina and her husband came out on New Year's Eve, and they had a supper that lasted 3 hours and involved a quantity of good food and a warmth in the dining room that had to do with people who had come to mean something real to each other. Frances looked around that table at Hattie, who had given her a locked room and a blue quilt and asked no questions, at Alina, who had given her friendship and information and the particular comfort of a woman who sees clearly and speaks honestly, at Wallace at the far end of the table with James on his knee, showing him something in the lamplight with that quiet patience, and felt the full, grounded weight of a life that was hers, genuinely hers, built from her own choices and her own courage, and the grace of having found the right people. She said nothing about this, because the moment did not require words. She simply held it. In the spring of 1887, Frances discovered she was expecting again, and the news was received at the Hadley Ranch with the same quiet, rooted joy as the first time. Wallace finished the cradle repair. James had done something to one of the rockers that required attention, and Amos began planning the meals he considered appropriate for a household expecting an addition. The second child was a daughter, born in October of 1887, and they named her Clara Rose. She was smaller than James had been and considerably quieter, and looked from her first days at the world around her with an alert, assessing attention that made Frances laugh. "She has your eyes," Wallace said. "She has your expression," Frances said. Both of these things were true. James, aged 3 and comprehensively the senior authority on ranch affairs in his own estimation, regarded his sister with the cautious interest of someone who has been told a thing is good, and is reserving judgment until personal experience confirms it. By the time Clara was 3 months old, James had reached the definitive conclusion that she was excellent and began introducing her to horses. The years that followed built themselves the way good years do, not without difficulty, because ranching in western Kansas in the 1880s was not without difficulty, and the drought years of the late decade tested everyone in the territory with the particular severity of a land that does not apologize for its extremity. But the Hadley ranch was well managed and well capitalized, and Wallace had made decisions in the fat years that protected them in the lean ones. And Frances's oversight of the accounts meant that they knew where they stood at every point and could respond to conditions with information rather than guesswork. They added to the herd in 1888 when prices were good, and they sold at the right time in 1889 when they were better. And when a young couple named Reardon tried to start a small dairy operation on the section adjacent to the Hadley land's western boundary, and ran into difficulty in their first winter, Wallace rode over with feed and Frances rode over with a week's worth of meals, and the Reardons became friends of the permanent variety. The fence dispute with Cutter on the eastern boundary resolved itself permanently in 1889 when Cutter, faced with a legal notice from Wallace's attorney and the clear-eyed knowledge that he had been in the wrong from the beginning, agreed to a surveyed boundary settlement that was filed with the county and never troubled anyone again. Frances noted this in the ranch records with a quiet satisfaction. Hattie Combs died in the winter of 1890, peacefully in her room at the boarding house, with a half-finished bowl of beans in her lap, because she had been snapping beans at the time, which was exactly the kind of death that suited her. Frances grieved her properly, not briefly, not privately, but with the full weight of what Hattie had been in her life, which was the first person in Redemption Creek to open a door for her without requiring anything in exchange. She went to the boarding house for the service and spoke about Hattie with the honesty that real grief deserves, and came home tired and quieter than usual, and Wallace held her that night without speaking, which was again the right thing. The boarding house was bought by a young couple from Ohio who painted the porch and replaced Hattie's red geraniums with yellow ones, which Frances thought Hattie would have had opinions about, and which she chose to find charming rather than wrong. Elena and her husband prospered. The saddle shop expanded in 1891 to include a harness operation, and Elena's dressmaking work grew with the town's growth, and their 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, were fixtures at the various celebrations and gatherings that Frances organized at the ranch, because Frances had discovered that she had a talent for gathering people together that she had not previously had the space or safety to exercise. Redemption Creek grew through the early 1890s with the methodical pace of a western town that has good water and good grazing land nearby, and a railroad spur that arrived in 1891 and was received by the town with the mixed feelings that railroad arrivals always provoked enormous practical benefit paired with the irreversible knowledge that the world had arrived and was not going away. Wallace watched the railroad with the careful, unsentimental assessment of a man who understands that the world changes, and the question is never whether to accept the change, but how to position yourself intelligently within it. He invested in the shipping infrastructure rather than fighting it, and the cattle shipping arrangement he negotiated with the railroad company in 1892 was considered by every rancher in the county to be the best deal secured by anyone in that negotiation, which surprised no one who knew him. James, by 1892, was 8 years old and had opinions about everything that he stated with his father's directness and his mother's precision, which combined into a quality that Amos described as extremely efficient, and Mrs. Pryor the midwife described, when she saw him at the 4th of July celebration that year, as formidably clear-headed for a child of that size. He was learning to ride properly, not just sitting on a horse but actually managing one, and he had begun accompanying Wallace on the shorter ranch circuits with the gravity of a boy who takes seriously the responsibilities he has been trusted with. Clara, at 5, was developing what Frances privately considered to be a completely unnecessary aptitude for charming horses that should by rights have been unmangeable, which she appeared to accomplish through a combination of patience and a particular quality of undivided attention that the horses responded to as if they had been waiting for it. Wallace watched this with tremendous satisfaction. "She's going to be better than me," he told Frances. "She already is," Frances said. He grinned at that, the full, unguarded grin that she had only seen after years of marriage and that she still considered the best thing she knew how to make happen. In the fall of 1893, Frances discovered she was expecting a third child, and the news was received at the supper table with James declaring it excellent and asking if it could be a brother, and Clara declaring that another sister would be preferable, and Wallace reaching across the table and taking Frances's hand with a warmth that said everything without saying anything. The third child was another boy, born in the spring of 1894, and named Thomas after no one in particular, simply a name they both liked and which seemed, when they said it in the context of the life they had built, entirely right. James received him with enthusiasm and immediately began planning the portion of Thomas's education that he personally intended to oversee, and Clara looked at him with the thoughtful attention with which she regarded all large questions and pronounced him acceptable, which from Clara meant excellent. The spring of 1894 was a good one, following 2 hard years. The grass came in thick and early. The cimarron ran clear. The cattle were fat, and the hay crop was going to be abundant, and the ranch was in the best financial position it had been in since the early part of the decade. Frances was sitting on the wide porch of the ranch house one afternoon in late April of that year, Thomas asleep in the cradle beside her, and the sound of James and Clara somewhere in the barn with the horses and the distant steady sounds of the ranch going about its work, when Wallace came up from the south pasture on his dark bay horse, a descendant of the horse he had been riding the first morning she saw him. Same color and temperament, and swung down at the gate and came up the porch steps and sat beside her in the other porch chair and looked out at the afternoon. After a while he said, "I was thinking about the courthouse." Frances glanced at him. "Were you?" "The day I went out there," he said. "Boone's lawyer was in there with the additional injunction papers. Carr had wired me what was coming the night before. I rode in before dawn." She had not known this. She had known he arrived before her, but she had not known about the wire. "I stood out there," he said, "and I thought about how to handle it legally, practically. And then I thought about you sitting in there not knowing what the outcome was going to be. And it seemed to me that the most useful thing I could do, while we waited for Carr's argument to move through the court, was make sure everyone in Redemption Creek understood exactly what the situation was, that she was not alone, that whatever Boone thought he was coming to do, the landscape had changed." Frances looked at the April afternoon, the huge Kansas sky and the greening grass and the cottonwoods along the creek in the first full leaf. "Those 4 words," she said. "4 words," he agreed. "They worked," she said. "I think it was mostly Carr's documentation," he said honestly, and she laughed. "Don't do that," she said. "Don't reduce it." He looked at her sideways. "I'm not reducing it. The documentation was the mechanism." But he was quiet for a moment. When I said it, I meant it as much as I've meant anything I've ever said. She has my name now. You had my name. You have my name." He paused. "Everything I have is yours, Frances. It has been since approximately the day you told me about the letters." "You always go back to the letters," she said. "It was a formative moment," he said, with the contained humor that she had learned to read in the set of his eyes. She reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he turned it and held hers, and they sat like that in the afternoon light, with Thomas asleep beside them, and the sounds of the ranch all around them, and the green spring moving across the Kansas plains in every direction as far as the eye could reach. Everything that had been taken from her, or tried to be taken, her safety, her name, her sense of what she was worth in the world, had not in the end been taken. She had run hard and smart and arrived in exactly the right place, and she had found in this man and this land and this life something that the road from St. Louis had given her no reason to expect, and that she had found anyway. She was Frances Hadley. It had taken her a while to feel it as completely as it was, but she felt it now, in the April afternoon with her sleeping son and her husband's hand, and the enormous, unindifferent sky above the Kansas plains. She felt it without reservation. She felt it all the way down. The years continued to lay themselves down like good land, with the patience and the beauty of things built to last. Thomas learned to walk and to ride and to argue, the last of these coming naturally in a household with two elder siblings who had already mapped the conversational territory and were not inclined to cede it. He was quieter than James and less independent than Clara, more inclined to attach himself to the nearest warm presence and simply stay there, which made him enormously popular with the dogs and with Amos, who gave him dried apple rings when he thought Frances wasn't watching. James grew into the kind of young man who makes his parents look at each other across the supper table with an expression of private astonishment. That combination of their best qualities and some qualities all his own, the total of it being somehow larger than the sum of its parts. He had Wallace's steady certainty and Frances's sharpness, and a gift for horses that was genuine and considerable. By the time he was 12, he was riding the full ranch circuit with his father, and understanding the decisions being made at each point with the engaged interest of someone who is already thinking about what those decisions will look like in 20 years. Clara developed a passionate interest in natural history that began with the horses and expanded to encompass every living thing on the ranch and eventually the surrounding territory as well. And she filled 3 journals with careful observations and drawings that Hattie would have been proud of. And she had plans, expressed with the firm clarity of her particular nature, for a future that involved considerable study. Frances supported this with everything she had. They had one more child after Thomas, another girl, born in 1897, named Margaret and called Maggie from approximately her second day, and who arrived into the family with the relaxed confidence of a child who understands that she is the youngest of 4 and has already calculated the advantages of that position. She had Frances's eyes and Wallace's jaw and a laugh that filled whatever room she was in, and that the whole family turned toward the way plants turn toward light. By the turn of the century, the Hadley Ranch was one of the most prosperous in the county, a fact that Wallace noted with satisfaction and no particular vanity, because prosperity was not something he valued for its own sake but for what it allowed. Security for the people who worked the land, education for his children, the ability to help the neighbors in the hard years. On a quiet evening in September of 1901, Frances was at the desk in the ranch office, going through the fall accounts when Wallace came in and set a cup of coffee beside her elbow, and looked over her shoulder at the figures with the comfortable ease of a man entirely at home with his surroundings. "We're going to have a good year," she said. "Yes," he said. "James thinks we should expand the south pasture." "James thinks many things," Wallace said with the pride and mild exasperation of a man who has succeeded perhaps too well in raising a son who has opinions. He's right about this one, Frances said. A pause. I know, Wallace said. I'm going to tell him that tomorrow. Frances smiled at the accounts. He'll be insufferable. Briefly, Wallace said. He'll get past it. She put her pen down and looked up at him, and he looked back at her. And there was nothing dramatic in the moment. Just a man and a woman in a ranch office on a September evening. 18 years into a life they had built together with their hands and their minds, and the kind of love that does not announce itself constantly, but is simply and continuously present, like the river to the west, like the grass, like the sky. I was thinking, she said, about that first summer, the boarding house. The storm on the porch. What about it? I was thinking about how frightened I was, she said, not of you, of wanting something, of letting it matter. I had gotten so carefully into the habit of not letting things matter. He said nothing, listening. And then there you were, she said, and you were so entirely, absolutely yourself, and I couldn't figure out how not to let it matter. She paused. I'm glad I couldn't. So am I, he said. I know it wasn't easy for you either. The legal situation and Boone and everything I brought with me. You brought yourself with you, he said. The rest of it was circumstance. She looked at him with the love that 18 years and 4 children, and a life made of real things had made into something too large and too rooted to require expression, but that she expressed anyway, because the words mattered. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, she said. He sat down in the chair across from the desk and looked at her with those gray eyes that still caught the light the way they had on the first morning she saw him, and said, "The feeling is entirely mutual." Outside, the September evening was settling its dark over the Hadley land, over the south pasture and the creek and the cottonwoods and the barn where the horses were quiet in their stalls. The house held its people, James in the bunkhouse with the hands, Clara in her room with her journal, Thomas asleep, Maggie still awake and working on some project that involved a considerable quantity of string and 3 of the dogs. The Cimarron moved west toward the horizon in its long, easy bends, and the stars were coming up over the Kansas plains one by one with the patience of things that have been there longer than trouble and will be there longer than any fear. Frances Hadley took her husband's hand across the desk and held it, and the lamplight held them both, and the night was entirely, perfectly at peace.